people don't have an explanation, materialistic explanation for the origin of information, but we do know of a cause that generates the kind of information that's present in DNA and in RNA, and that is a mind.
Imagine you're walking on the beach. What if there's a bunch of pieces of driftwood and they're all in a certain shape that spells help? You're not going to assume for a minute that there wasn't a person, a mind, that drugged the driftwood into place to create the letters.
When we encounter information, we instinctively, invariably recognize the activity of a mind for a good reason.
It actually makes me think about, in Mere Christianity, what I love about that book is C.S. Lewis sort of very stepwise goes about, he doesn't try to prove too much too fast. He sort of starts with, hey, if we have an engine, we can't look within the plane of engines to figure out where engines were made. We have to go to a higher plane, the plane of man, to figure out. And he goes, therefore, wouldn't it be somewhat reasonable to assume we might have to go one plane up, something outside of the plane of man? That's a design argument,
isn't it?
Yeah. And he even says, I'm not getting within a million miles of the God of the Bible right now. He's like, I'm just trying to say, logically, doesn't it make sense that something had to create an engine, that's man, something therefore would have had to create man. I mean, again, whether it's the God of the Bible or not, can we just agree that it's not illogical? It's not an ignorance thing to say it must be some type of super intelligence. He doesn't use that word, of course, but it also makes me think, John Lennox had this really great, I don't know if it was original, but I remember him saying it. He goes, imagine you're walking on the beach, and you see a couple pieces of driftwood on the beach. Well, you're not going to think anything of that. But what if there's a bunch of pieces of driftwood and they're all in a certain shape that spells help? You can talk about, all the different laws of physics that caused or somehow got the driftwood onto the beach, but you're not going to assume for a minute that there wasn't a person, a mind, that drugged the driftwood into place to create the letters. And I think that feels like kind of what you just talked about a little bit, is like, it's not just about the physics and how does that work? But there's got to be there's a mind behind it. It seems as if there's a mind behind this.
Yeah, the laws of physics are expressed as differential equations or in the form of algorithms. They typically describe highly regular patterns of physical phenomena, things that recur over and over again. Sun up, sun down, all matter gravitates. Drop the ball, it falls. I drop the ball, it falls. I drop the ball, it falls. But information is a different kind of beast. It's not a matter of a strictly repetitive pattern. It's something that's often very aperiodic. We often will refer to it as complex or improbable, but it's specified by sequence in order to do something functional. So there's a functional output. And we have lots of examples of information in our own experience. We have digital code in software. We have alphabetic characters in a paragraph in a book. I used the example of the Rosetta Stone a few minutes ago. There's the hieroglyphic inscriptions. I guess there's two different forms of Egyptian writing on the Rosetta Stone. So information and simple repetitive order are not the same thing. And when we encounter information, we instinctively, invariably recognize the activity of a mind for a good reason. And that is because whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. There was a famous information scientist who was a pioneer in the application of the information sciences and informational analysis to looking at the DNA molecule, looking at the cell. And he said, an offhand moment, he said, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. That's something we know. That's something we know from our experience. Now, why is all that irrelevant to a discussion about sort of ultimate issues? Well, the great discovery, or one of the great discoveries of 20th century science, was that at the foundation of life, there is a molecule, actually more than one, but a very important molecule called DNA that stores information in a digital or alphabetic form. If you go back to 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule as they're trying to figure out what is responsible for the transmission of hereditary information. They elucidate the structure. 4 years later, in 1957, 1958, Crick formulates something called the sequence hypothesis, in which he realizes that the chemical subunits along the interior of the famous twisting helix, it has this famous sugar phosphate backbone. On the interior of that backbone are chemical subunits called bases or nucleotide bases. And Crick realizes that they are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or like the zeros and ones in a section of machine code. In particular, they're providing instructions for building the proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. Now, interestingly, Crick had been a code breaker in World War II. And so he was particularly sensitive to the transfer of information and understanding what was required to do it. And he recognized an information processing system at work inside the cell. One of the great physicists of that time period, named George Gamow, began to look at Crick's discovery and realize that the chemical subunits, which are represented with letters now, A, C, G, and T short for their chemical names, he realized that these are functioning like a digital bit string. That you've got something that's very much like the zeros and ones in a section of computer code. And these zeros and ones, or the ACs, Gs, and Ts rather, are not randomly arranged. They're not in a repetitive sequence, AT, 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 AG, AG. They are aperiodic, very complex arrangement, but that complexity is necessary, that specificity of arrangement is necessary for them to perform the function of building these protein machines. So we've got something very much like that here in the Seattle area with, say, at the Boeing plant, where they use CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and manufacture, where the engineer will write some code, will go down a wire, it will be translated into another form of machine code that can be read at a manufacturing apparatus, and then that information will be used, for example, to place the rivets on the wing at the right place. You've got digital code directing the construction of a mechanical system. That's what's going on inside cells. And it's just absolutely mind-blowing. And this discovery then raised this huge question. We know what the information does. We know where it resides, but where did it come from?
Yeah.
And when you ask that ultimate origins question, you start looking at the different possibilities. This is why my books are so fat. I do look at all the different possibilities. They've all failed. And this is almost universally recognized in, for example, the field of origin of life research. People don't have an explanation, materialistic explanation for the origin of information, but we do know of a cause that generates the kind of information that's present in DNA and in RNA, and that is a mind. And so the inference to intelligent design, again, is based on our positive knowledge of cause and effect and our positive knowledge of what's actually present inside cells.
Again, I really wanted to just address that because I know the God of the Gaps thing comes up, but this is really saying, no, the evidence actually does lead, to this idea that there's a mind behind this, and again, just like whether you're finding the driftwood on the beach or you're finding the code, the specificity within the cell, someone had to write the code.
The driftwood on the beach is a great illustration because it doesn't take very much information to trigger the awareness of a mind behind the system that you're looking at.
Yeah.
But I've just talked about the information in DNA necessary to build a protein. And what we're also finding is that information, there are at least two separate information processing systems in the cell. The one that's responsible for building the proteins and protein machines that keep the cell alive. There's another processing system that's responsible for what's called DNA replication. So when the cell divides, you want to have a copy of that complement of genetic information in each new cell. There's a whole sophisticated information processing system there that is absolutely mind-blowing. Every single engineering feature you would need to accomplish the copying of that information that's wound very tightly in this amazing structure is provided. All these different molecular machines that are necessary. And then you get to higher level organisms, you've got circuitry that is necessary to express the information in different types of cells at different times during the development of, say, an animal form. And that circuitry, when you map it out, is tightly integrated. It looks like an integrated circuit, only what's being controlled is not the flow of electricity, but the flow of information. So you've got circuitry, you've got informational rich molecules, you've got information processing systems, and you've got miniature machinery that's at work processing all that information and doing all the other jobs inside cells that are necessary to keep living organisms alive. You've got little rotary engines and turbines and sliding clamps and little robotic walking motor proteins that tow vesicles of material along predetermined, essentially railroad tracks, taking material from one part of the cell to the other. It's an automated factory. All of this is going on inside the cells in your body right now as we speak. And in the 19th century, when Darwin first developed the argument in the origin of species, other biologists at the time, in particular his great British bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, were saying things like, the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. It's just a bunch of chemical goo. And when you think that's what life is in its essence, it's easy to imagine how it might have arisen through a few chemical reactions. No longer. At every new juncture in the history of biology from the late 19th century onward, we've just discovered layers within layers within layers of complexity. And as Jim Tour, the great organic chemist at Rice University, likes to say, the goalposts just keep receding. The problem of explaining the origin of life just keeps getting harder the more we learn about exactly what it takes to build even a simple one-celled organism. The simple cell is not simple. So we're seeing features that are known to be produced, again, by one and only one type of cause, that being intelligence. And we're seeing it at every level. It's not just the code in the DNA, it's the way the information is processed. It's not just the processing systems, it's the machinery that are involved in the processing. It's not just the processing in one-celled organisms, it's the whole circuitry that coordinates the timing and expression of that information as you're building animals. It's just awesome.